Okay.
Welcome to Insights Over Espresso. I'm your host, Joe Marone, and today I'm joined by Bob Trevelyan with his dual role as CEO of Xalles Holdings and a key leader at Ascent Business Partners. So, Bob, can you start by sharing a little bit about the journey that led you to oversee both an AI-led CX optimization and a holding company focused on really disruptive technology? I'm sure the listeners would love to hear how you got here.
Well, it's an interesting challenge, but basically, I've been involved on pushing the envelope on data and data information. I would say back about 35 years, actually, since I started in the IT business, in the technology business. I was always involved. In fact, I worked for IBM years ago, and IBM asked me to figure out where they had to be in the future. IBM Canada, where they had to be in the future, and I was working with some of the major banks in Canada as clients, and so I was always pushing the envelope on things like data warehousing, and then I followed that curve, if you will, and really started addressing the new challenges we were facing everywhere in the business world. Masses of disparate information, inability to be able to bring information together, really building analytic platforms that made sense that people could use at the very front line, because my view is that if you can't put something out in front of your users who are facing the customer, then it's a worthless exercise. So you really need to automate the power of the company for the people facing the customer. So I've always pushed the envelope. I was invited to join Teradata. Was there for two sessions, I guess I would say. But Teradata was really all about bringing all disparate information together into one platform, so you could do analytics and you could do really understand what's going on. And a basic buzzword I used all the time at Teradata was, if you knew everything about yourself and your customer, would you do business differently? And so really started pushing the envelope there. Then I got into very high-end analytics with a startup company out of San Francisco called Hyperparallel. And we were actually building models that would do things like analyzing bank customers who are going to close their accounts 6 weeks from today. How do you find them, and then how do you stop them from leaving? And really a really weird pushing the envelope with gazillions of chunks of data. In that case, we had 5 million information on 5 million customers dating back to 1906, and we actually built a profile with real elements, and then there was calculated elements. And for example, one of the banking ones we did, just as an example, was I want to find those accounts that are going to close their accounts in 6 weeks. We interviewed at the same time all the bank executives, and the bank executives all said that the most important thing was somebody closing their checking account would be an indicator that they're going to go away. Turns out it wasn't that. It was an acceleration of use of their checking account that was the indicator. So it was 27th on the list, by the way, what the bank's executive had to say. So I pushed the envelope into that, as I said, into mass data analytics, AI, in the early stages of AI. How do you understand machine learning, AI and machine learning? How do you actually understand the vast amounts of data that you're trying to deal with? And then how do you make decisions on that vast amount of data? So it's been a really interesting journey. It's taken me all around the world. I've worked in Australia and all over Europe, in Canada, in the US, Brazil, Mexico. So it's really been a heck of a journey, but it really has given me insight into the challenges that all businesses have in understanding how to deal with the data they've got, the knowledge that they've got, and the customers. That's a diverse element in the equation. So that's a real short summary.
Interesting background. So Xalles Holdings recently underwent a significant restructuring, and that's what led you to step into the CEO role. What was the core strategic driver behind that major change, and how does this new performance model differ from Xalles' previous operating model?
Operating model at Xalles before this latest change was one where we would two phases. One is we were acquiring companies for stock, and then working with the companies. The intent being that we would get those companies successful, spin them off. We would make money out of doing that, and then go on to the next level of that. We expanded that to include startups, and a whole bunch of startups globally, that we thought had presence, and we did a serious analysis of the startups that were out there. Ended up with about 30, 34, 35 within the portfolio as a starting point. But we needed investment dollars for the startups, and we needed to be able to spin off some of these acquisitions that we had made earlier, neither of which was happening. And so we had to make a decision to wholesale change to get ourselves in a position of strength where we could, in fact, invest in companies at the same time as we would invest in our portfolio of companies. So we've slimmed down the entire company. We've slimmed down all of our acquisitions, spun most of them off to date. And we're about to start rebuilding again, based on the foundation of one company in particular, a company called Adaptive Analytics. So we are putting all of our time and effort into that company to try and make a difference there and get them in a position where they can get funded by external sources and then move on. So it's been an interesting exercise to go through over the last couple of years, going through that whole cycle. Business models are changing today. And because we were on the forefront, we saw a huge change coming at us. So we decided to get ahead of the curve. And that's what we've done.
So in our pre-call, you mentioned being a little bit of an AI skeptic despite your deep involvement in this space. Can you elaborate on what exactly makes you skeptical and how that skepticism informs your strategy when evaluating and implementing AI solutions, at both Xalles and Ascent?
Well, I think that my involvement in AI has been an interesting journey, I would say. The exciting part about AI and machine learning is the fact that you take the human element out of this, and you can handle the vast amounts of data that are available to us to actually make decisions. The challenge with a lot of AI today is it's all based on large language models, which is only one element of intelligence, and it doesn't take into account the ability of organizations and or people to do things with the data at their head, or the information and data at their fingertips, to be able to make a better decisions and to make a better company overall. I think the hype around AI today is still around large language model, but realistic, I've been dealing with large language models for 25 years or more. And, they're great. It's garbage in, garbage out, and personified. And when you start bringing inaccurate data or inappropriate data together with other inappropriate data, you get really inappropriate data. And that's one of the challenges I see where we are today. I think that there are great advances made because of the speed of computing and the availability of data itself. But I think that there still needs to be a lot of thought process around what is intelligence. Intelligence isn't stringing together previously used words. Intelligence is creating new decision points based on all of the elements that are around the decision. That's what artificial intelligence should be. I think we're seeing some of it out there in the marketplace. But as a general rule, we're using large language models to pick data up. That's all we're doing.
So you mentioned in that pre-call, Ascent focuses on AI-led CX and contact center optimization. Our research shows that, that's a market projected to cut global labor. We don't have a crystal ball, but research says, by 80 billion by 2026. What would you say is the single most disruptive trend in contact center space right now? And what's the biggest mistake enterprises are making when they're trying to adopt conversational AI?
Very good question. I think my personal opinion is that we can take a lot of the mundane interactions between companies and customers, or companies and employees. We can take all of that and automate it and speed it up and make it better. I mean, the work that's going on right now in capturing voice in multiple languages and everything else, and then being able to translate that into some sort of an answer, I think is absolutely remarkable. I think it's something that I've actually been working with for way too many years. But I think the fact that what we're seeing right now is really, really, really powerful. But it doesn't solve the problem. It's still a lot of garbage in, garbage out. Whenever you hear of a company talking about AI models, they talk about, golden data, but they're not doing that. I mean, they're not providing that core reality of data. One of my former clients from a world market penetration perspective, a company out of Switzerland called Diden, have been doing some magical work around AI using artificial intelligence to actually clean the data, to create a clean data store, which now you can make decisions from. If you haven't got clean data, you can't make decisions on it. And that includes simple things like just natural language rules. How do you actually go about doing that with the natural language if the natural language is wrong in the first place? I mean, it really is a huge challenge. I think, from the contact center perspective, my perspective is that it's in its early stages, and it's getting better and better every day. But the reality is that I don't know if you talked to a contact center lately, and you get this AI engine says, "Well, I can't help you anymore." Well, what do? The AI engine gives up because it can't answer your question because it's a little bit off of the complex data or data that system doesn't have access to. That can be a challenge. But ones that do it right, I think we are in a brand new world of understanding, capturing, and using speech to be able to really understand, and not only speech, but also things like intonation and presence as a call center agent, all that kind of stuff. All that stuff, I think, is in its infancy right now, but it's getting better every day. And I think there's some marvelous tools out there in the marketplace. Right?
Yeah, there are. I spent a fair amount of time in that space. So Ascent uses
So
Yeah. Prior to jumping into this, I was with Zendesk, and then I was with a company called DevRev, which was a native AI startup. So Ascent uses, a curated portfolio of AI vendors approach, emphasizing try before you buy. Given the rapid pace of AI development, what would you say are the top 1 to 2 non-negotiable criteria you use to vet and select an AI solution for inclusion in Ascent's client recommendations?
First and foremost, in my mind, is speed. And human conversation, like you and I are having right now, is very, very carefully evaluated based on how you interact. The speech isn't just what comes out of your mouth. It's how you position yourself, how you look, everything about our communication style. And I think there's some great strides being made in that direction. We're seeing solutions today that actually can really start to address the whole presence of a conversation as opposed to just the verbal response. So first and foremost, I think that's critical. Secondly, is that you have to have an ability to be able to have all of the information, everything that you need to know to be able to support a question, same as a human does in dealing with another human. If you ask me a question I didn't know the answer to, I would tell you I don't know the answer to that, but let me go and research it, and I'll get back to you with an answer. You can't really do that in a call center environment. If you don't have the data, it tends to just collapse. And I've been through that several times in the last couple of weeks with call centers where they just couldn't help me, and they basically said, "Well, we give up." Whereas it should be automatically moved over to with the history to a live agent who can actually think their way through the problem. It's just not being done. So I think there's a lot of shortcuts that are being taken with the intent of cutting labor costs in dealing with conversations with clients and whatnot. But I think that a good AI solution needs to be able to inject a human into the situation as quickly as possible, instantaneously, if you can. And I think that those are the critical things to me: speed and ability to get a thinking process as opposed to a reiterative process into the equation.
Yeah, I would agree 100%. So let's look at the Xalles side for a moment. What's the most critical, non-obvious signal that you look for when evaluating a potential fintech or AI acquisition target today, beyond the standard
It's a good
finance?
question because I think that's something that is we tend to forget about when we look at things. We look at the performance, we look at the numbers, we look at whatever. Whenever I meet a startup, and first question is, why did you do this? To the founders, I want to know what the chemistry is behind the decision to do something in business, and that may be as simple as one company I worked with. Her mother had died drug complication simply because the instructions weren't clear. And so she started a company to clarify instructions for pharmaceutical recommendations for people, just simply to be able to help them translate into their own speed, the person who's taking the medicine, what speed they can go at, what their understanding level is, what language they are in. And this woman started this fabulous little company on doing that, just automating capture of information. But it was all about a personal relationship. I always sit down and I spend the first half hour to 45 minutes of a conversation with a startup on why they did it. What's the personality behind it? What's the driving force behind it? What creates the energy behind it? Then I start looking at things like numbers. because numbers lie. I don't know how many business plans you've looked at over your career, but I've looked at thousands and thousands, and you can't sit here today and say I'm going to earn $10,000 next month. You can't. No matter what you might be able to get half of that. You might be able to get 3 times that. But how do you come up to a net figure in 6 months from now? You can't see the future. So how do you go about doing that more intelligent? And that's what I look for in startups. I want to understand the passion behind it, why they're doing it, and I want to be able to understand that they can pivot, because there's always going to be roadblocks. There's always going to be bumps in the road. How do you pivot to go to the next level?
Yeah, I'd agree. So Ascent is scaling from a project-based advisory to more repeatable offerings. So how's the team balancing the need to standardize playbooks and package pilots with maintaining that white glove credibility and the high touch service that your enterprise clients expect?
One of the things that I do, Joe, is I have done this a lot around the world. I work with corporations to find out what makes them tick. So I'll go into organizations, and I've done this over 200 times, where I'll go in anywhere from a month to 6 months working with an organization about understanding and prioritizing where they invest in people, machinery, software, whatever it might happen to be, clients, whatever. Where do they invest and why do they invest in those? Once you understand that, it can help an organization prioritize and figure out where they're going to put their money and their effort, and get importantly, get their entire team on the same footpath. Then I think that's going to be a challenge. So my advice is to really understand who you are, the company, who they are, where they come from, where they're going, and then help them prioritize their investments. And investments are not just the money; it's time and people, and how do you predict? Again, it goes back to flexibility and being able to pivot. How do you predict where the market's going to go, and can you adjust to that? So I've done as I said, over 200 of those going into organization, major Fortune 100 companies around and globally. Same basic fundamental problems. I think there's almost always a disjoint between the guy at the top and the guy at the bottom, and so culture is a huge issue. I think that it really needs to be well understood. And the companies that I see that are really successful have a culture that goes through the organization, that the person on the front line with the customer espouses the same culture and attitude and whatnot as the CEO, and everybody in between does the same thing. So those are the successful companies, and so I try to help companies get there by starting out with prioritization and then an evaluation of prioritization and a group, if you will, but really come down to, how do you make a difference? And you make a difference by deciding on what you're going to do and then go and do it, execute on it. And I know it sounds simple. This whole thing is very simple. It's like sales 101. What can I do for you, Mr. Customer? If I can do that, would you buy something? I mean, they're simple questions.
Yeah.
But they're very far-reaching when you start looking at organizations dealing with other organizations, and how do you manage that process? It's really quite and interesting to going into major corporations and sitting down with the entire executive team, from finance to manufacturing to whatever it might happen to be, and talk about what's important to them. And you find in a lot of cases it's totally different between executives, and that's not the way you're going to get a successful company. You have to have a focus and a drive towards a certain goal. Believe me, I've set some pretty weird conversations with executives of major corporations that are successful.
Yeah.
Fortune 1000 companies are still around today from where they were 10 years ago. That's always the question.
So for Xalles, integrating commercializing portfolio companies can be a really resource intensive. So in your new role, what's the single biggest obstacle you face in standardizing the go-to-market strategy and providing shared AI and data capabilities across the different subsidiaries?
Very good question. And one of the biggest challenges CEOs have in this day in particular, being able to find the correct resource with the correct ability in this changing world. So I think My perspective going forward, I think you really need to have a small number of very strong generalists, all with an IT base to some degree, and move forward. But sort of an odd sort of group would be the finance guys, financial officer of the company, the chief legal counsel of the company. They all have to think differently. They all have to think around what are the implications of technology on the organization, and how am I going to adopt that to be successful. And so I think you need a small cadre of really bright people who come from a strong background of data, information knowledge, IT, and industry domain expertise.
Okay. If you could deploy one shared AI service across Xalles portfolio right now, something that would benefit the majority of your subsidiaries immediately, what might that service be, and what's the expected return on that investment?
That's a wow question. Very good one. I think the reality of the situation today is the fact that if you can get machine learning, AI types of environments to be able to determine results that you're looking for out of the massive data around client information or our own company information, and be able to analyze that on a regular basis, daily, really have to evaluate that on a daily basis. That's where I would apply any of these technologies, to be able to look at the data associated with a client, with the client's customers, with the client's industry, with us, and how we deal with the client. All those things, to be able to get AI tools to analyze that. It includes finance. It includes general terms like market, what the market conditions are, what are the competitive conditions that are changing, what are the breakthrough technologies that are going to impact the business. Something to help evaluate all of that and bring that together. The challenge we have today is way too much information and not enough understanding. And so how do we get to that state? So I would deploy machine learning and AI in that arena in particular, for both my clients and for my own company.
So going back to our pre-call, you mentioned the goal of cloning. And I see this a lot in many of my conversations where so much knowledge and understanding is locked in the key person's head. You mentioned the goal of cloning your thought process to drive success. So hypothetically, if you had a magic wand and could triple the efficiency of one team at the new Xalles, whether it's deal sourcing, investor relations, internal operations, which team would you choose? And what would be the immediate measurable impact?
Going back what I just said, being able to understand the information about what's going on around us, I think, is the core to decision making. And going back to the cloning, the discussion we had in the pre-call was cloning myself, because I've seen, for example, I told you about these 200 or so work with global companies to be able to understand their internal process. I've had people say, "Oh, I can do that internally. We're not going to hire you. We're going to do it internally." And then 6 months they call me back and say, "Can you come and help us because we didn't get it right?" And the reason is, you need today, as a business manager, you need a wealth of information in hundreds of industries, not just your own. You need to be able to understand the impact across the entire business community of anything that goes on. And I've got now hundreds of former clients and customers and my companies I've worked with, that all of the challenges they had were all stored in my head, and to get out to somebody else is almost impossible. And I've tried it. I mean, I've taught consulting and taught people how to go about the process, but people, well, I can do it short. I can make a shortcut and do it better, and you can't. You really have to understand the implications of what you're saying. What questions do you, and when you ask of a competitor or a potential customer or whatnot, questions you ask have very big implications as to how you react to them. So having experience in different industries makes you better at questioning, to be able to get a better understanding of what's going on. So cloning, that in my case, I think would be of value. But I also have all kinds of bad habits, so I don't want to clone those bits. So how do you do the good bits only?
Well, we're going to take just the good bits. So where would you lean, though? Going back to the question, would you lean on deal sourcing, internal operations? Where do you think so far, in your point of view, in your new role, of where the most effort is?
I think it's sourcing potential offerings for particular client. I think that the sourcing of the offering and what it can do and everything else is very critical to figuring out who you offer it to. And I believe that by doing a really good job of understanding that, it really helps you figure out what clients to go, and that drives your success overall. I think it's very easy to say and be flippant about the whole thing. So I can offer a solution to everybody. You can, but it's not going to be the same solution.
Right.
How do you do that? So
So for a holding company model, predictable, standardized
I
reporting.
trade secrets here now.
Yeah. Predictable, standardized reporting and growth across the portfolio are key. So are you actively seeking unified systems that can provide that level of oversight, or is the focus currently more decentralized for Xalles?
That's a very good question, Joe, because I think you hit the nail on the head. Do we do that internally? Look at our processes internally, how we go about doing business, all that kind of stuff, and then we look at that, and do we do that separate from looking at how we do the customers? I think the big challenge for me is how do we take what we do internally and apply that to a customer to make them successful. And that includes things like being smart, like automating, being data intelligent, really working with the wealth of information that we have available to us about our company. How do we take that with the wealth of information about our potential client, and how do we make that merge? And I think that is the secret, and that's going to be the requirement going forward. As I mentioned, we're focused on one company called Adaptive Analytics right now, and I'm working very, very closely with the management team about everything from positioning to culture to hiring to everything that they're doing in parallel to what I'm doing with the parent company, if you will. We're doing it together. And then and that becomes a problem when you start getting big and you start getting, 20 or 30 or different subsidiaries and whatnot. How do you make sure that culture goes across all of those things? And that's a full-time job in itself. And so I think, so you really have to be very aware of it. And there's been some great individuals that I've met over the years that were really good at standardizing that sort of approach and then being successful at it. I'm going to try and emulate them as we go forward and see where we go.
I'm sure you'll do a great job. You mentioned in a pre-call that you're working on an article for CEOs about avoiding the trap of investing in AI without a strong understanding of the implications. So what would you say is the single most important piece of advice you would give a CEO today about prioritizing and investing in technology?
The single piece of advice would be to get your team on the same page. We look at a lot of companies today that have strong technology oriented individuals. We have strong functional orientation. We have strong manufacturing orientations, for example. Whatever it might happen to be, but how do you get everybody on the same page? One of the things that I have done successfully over the last many years was be able to work with an organization to bring their management team together, whether they like it or not, to force on them the decision based on what's the reality of what we're dealing with here. I have no hesitation in bringing together all of the senior executives in a major organization and say, this is what I heard. I don't say who I heard it from. I said, this is what I heard. And then watch the reaction and get a reaction from that. But really, your real goal is to get everybody on the same page. And if you have somebody who's in an organization who thinks they're an AI genius and they want to apply AI across the company, you really need to temper that with the other executives in the different roles and different roles, whether it be finance or manufacturing, whatever it happen to be, that may or may not want to use AI or maybe cannot use AI in their function. So we need the consensus is, or this is what the direction is from my management team, as opposed to what I think or Joe Blow, who the technologist thinks. We need to have a comprehensive whole going forward. And that's the biggest advice I give. That
Interesting.
makes sense?
So it dovetails into my next question and actually last. What's one piece of actionable advice that you would give to a founder or an executive listening today who's looking to leverage AI to industrialize their own advisory or holdings model?
Pretty good at these questions, Joe. It goes back to what I said earlier in looking at founders. What is the passion that brought this together? Why did this happen? Why are you doing what you're doing? And do you hire people that share your vision and share your energy and share your impetus to make things new and different and whatever it might happen to be? And so I think from a founder's perspective, that is what I see is one of the biggest drivers of success or not success, is that passion, that core belief. Realistically, things change. You have to be able to pivot. You have to be able to move in different directions at a drop of a hat. But do you do it as a group or do you do it as a fractionalized world? So from a founder's perspective, you want to be able to have a management team that goes with you no matter which way you go. And so how do you hire the right people to be able to get there?
Yeah. Okay. So where can our listeners learn more about you, Xalles Holding, and Ascent Business Partners?
Well, Xalles Holdings is a publicly held company on the OTC. XALL is the stock. There's some pretty good information about me on my website, Trevelyan Group, on the internet, www.trevelyan.com. It gives you some insight into some of the places and things I've been. Joe, honestly, I have worked with so many companies around the world for so long. The list I have of things that I've done is every time I look at it, I go, did I really do all that?
Yeah.
And the answer is yeah, and it's taken me all around the globe. But I think being a Canadian, number one, I have a different perspective than a lot of nationalist organized like people, Americans or Germans in Germany or British in Britain. You really need to have an interest in what's going on and how the different cultures affect the different structures that you're trying to build. And I think that, that from a startup founder perspective and from a executive perspective, you really need to uncover those capabilities within your organization, make them visible to your client base and to your competitors.
Well, Bob, thank you for sharing such incredible insights. It's been a pleasure having you on the show, and I'm sure the listeners are going to love hearing the actual recording once we can post it up.
Well, I look forward to it. I look forward to seeing it, and I thank you very much for the time, and I thank you very much for the questions. They are very, very poignant questions, and they really make one think, and that's what we have to do as business executives. That's what we have to do everywhere. Okay, man. Well, you take care of yourself, Joe.
All right. Cheers.